Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Turn your cell phones off, please, right now. Thank you for coming to tonight's program with Elizabeth Winkler and Kathleen Schine. I'm Andrea Grossman, the founder of Writer's Bloc, now in our 27th season, sort of hurling to the end of my 27th season. Thank you. I want to thank my partners here at the Abel for making this gorgeous and historic room by LA standards, not by Stratford standards, available for us tonight. The Abel, by the way, is a membership organization, and they want all of you to join. It's not mandatory. I am a member, and I really love being here. They have great programs, even when they're not Writer's Bloc programs. For example, Adam Schiff was here last week, and I missed it, but which I'm really sorry about. Anyway, now for tonight. So anyway, to join the Abel, go on their website, and they'll be really happy. This is the kind of program I love, where history, timeless literature, and fabulous detective work all come together. Who wrote all of these plays attributed to William Shakespeare of Stratford? Doubters of Shakespeare's authorship or heretics will delight in Elizabeth Winkler's personal and often pretty hilarious exploration. She guides us through anonymous attributions, studies of contemporary signatures, his retirement in Stratford lacking any identity as a writer, even an empty grave, and possible alternatives, some of them women. But apart from the literary detective work, I love Elizabeth Winkler's approach because it forces us past the authorship question, making us ask why this insistence of mythologizing the guy from Stratford, known as William Shakespeare, has persisted for 450 years. I really love this. Kathleen Schine also looks at history in her novels. She offers us literary Easter eggs every time she writes a novel. These novels look at very contemporary family issues through her prism of humor, parent and sibling tension, debt to family lore, and the crushing weight of history, somehow without that history crushing us. Her new novel, out just recently, The Künstlers in Paradise, is a meditation on memory and how it impels one generation in a family to appreciate and love one that came before. So here's what's going to happen tonight. Elizabeth and Kathy will yak for a little while, and then you can ask questions. Please, no speeches, just questions, because you are all really smart, interested individuals with opinions. I can tell because I heard when you were all coming in. So no speeches, just questions, and I will give you a mic to ask your question. Books are out in the lobby for sale through Chevalier's. Elizabeth's book is released today. So this is the date of publication for Shakespeare Was a Woman. And I think somebody wrote me that it was Dante's birthday or something. So as if that has, that's supposed to mean something. Anyway, so I'm glad for Dante. And so these books will sell out. So anyway, thank you so much, Elizabeth Winkler and Kathleen Schine.
Thank you all so much for coming out to discuss Shakespeare with me on a Tuesday night. So delightful to see you all. I thought I'd begin by sharing a little bit about the Shakespeare authorship question for those who haven't heard about it before or want to know more. So I'll give you a little spiel, and then Kathy and I will jump into the Q&A. The Shakespeare authorship question, the theory that William Shakespeare might not have written the works published under his name, is the most horrible, vexed, unspeakable subject in the history of English literature. Among scholars, even the phrase Shakespeare authorship question elicits contempt. Eye-rolling, name-calling, mudslinging. If you raise it casually in a social setting, someone might chastise you as though you've uttered a deeply offensive profanity. Someone else might get up and leave the room. Tears may be shed. A whip may be produced. You will be punished, which is to say educated, because it is obscene to suggest that the God of English literature might be a false god. It is heresy. This is curious because many of our greatest writers and thinkers have suspected that the name was a pseudonym for a concealed author. Literary history is full of writers who concealed their identity, and the Renaissance was a particularly great age of assumed names. Henry James wrote, "I am sort of haunted by the conviction that the divine William was the biggest and most successful fraud ever practiced on a patient world." Walt Whitman agreed, "We all know how much mythos there is in the Shakespeare question. The poet of democracy was no snob, but he suspected that there was another mind behind the plays." Mark Twain wrote, "So far as anybody actually knows and can prove, Shakespeare of Stratford never wrote a play in his life. All the rest of his vast history, as furnished by the biographers, is built up, course upon course of guesses, inferences, theories, conjectures, an Eiffel Tower of artificialities rising sky high." For Vladimir Nabokov, the mystery inspired a poem. "You easily, regretlessly relinquish the laurels, concealing for all time your monstrous genius beneath a mask," he wrote. "Reveal yourself, god of iambic thunder, you hundred-mouthed, unthinkably great bard." I've come to see the authorship question as a kind of metaphor for the problem of history, of how we know what we think we know about the past. It's also a metaphor for the problem of authority, of who has the authority to determine the truth about the past. In England, in the summer of 1964, the question came before the courts, and it's a fascinating trial. I want to tell you a little bit about it briefly. So cast your minds, if you will, back to the summer of 1964. A woman named Miss Evelyn May Hopkins had died, and she left a third of her inheritance to the Francis Bacon Society for the purpose of finding the original manuscripts of Shakespeare's plays. The aim of finding them was to prove that Francis Bacon, the Elizabethan philosopher and statesman, was the true author of the works attributed to Shakespeare. Her heirs were not pleased. Naturally, they wanted the money for themselves. Seeking to reclaim their inheritance, they brought a suit against the society, arguing that Miss Hopkins' bequest should be overturned on the grounds that the search would be a wild goose chase. To support their case, they solicited the testimony of scholarly experts. Counsel for the next of kin describe it as a wild goose chase, but wild geese can, with good fortune, be apprehended, observed the Right Honorable Richard Wilberforce, a justice of Her Majesty's High Court. Many discoveries are unlikely until they are made, he pointed out. One may think of the Codex Sinaiticus, or the tomb of Tutankhamun, or the Dead Sea Scrolls. Wilberforce was a stolid Englishman, a former classic scholar at Oxford who rose through Britain's legal ranks to become a senior law lord in the House of Lords and a member of the Queen's Privy Council, so no fool. Having reviewed the evidence submitted to the court, he summarized it as follows. The orthodox opinion, which at the present time is unanimous, or nearly so, among scholars and experts in 16th and 17th century literature and history, is that the plays were written by William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon, actor. However, he continued, the evidence in favor of Shakespeare's authorship is quantitatively slight. It rests positively in the main on the explicit statements in the first folio of 1623, which is the collection of Shakespeare's plays that turns 400 this year. Negatively, he continued, on the lack of any challenge to this ascription at the time. Furthermore, there are a number of difficulties in the way of the traditional ascription, a number of known facts which are difficult to reconcile. One of these you've probably heard of is that when Shakespeare died, he left a will bequeathing his various properties and holdings, and he made no mention of any writings in his will, no poems, plays, or manuscripts of any kind. Did he have no concern for their preservation? Why didn't he say anything about his poems? Several major narrative poems, 154 sonnets. So far from these difficulties tending to diminish with time, the intensive search of the 19th century has widened the evidentiary gulf between William Shakespeare the man and the author of the plays, noted the justice. He went on to consider the testimony of the scholarly experts, Kenneth Muir, King Alfred Professor of English Literature at the University of Liverpool, supported the plaintiffs. He considered it certain that Bacon could not have written the works of Shakespeare. Hugh Trevor Roper, Regis Professor of Modern History at Oxford, departed slightly from his English literature colleagues, taking what the justice deemed a more cautious line. Though Professor Trevor Roper definitely does not believe the works of Shakespeare could have been written by Francis Bacon, he also considers that the case for Shakespeare rests on a narrow balance of evidence, and that new material could upset it. That though almost all professional scholars accept Shakespeare's authorship, a settled scholarly tradition can inhibit free thought, that heretics are not necessarily wrong. His conclusion is that the question of authorship cannot be considered as closed. Justice Wilberforce agreed. The question was not closed. The evidence for Shakespeare was too slim, the problems too many. The scholars might be wrong. Even if Francis Bacon was unlikely, new material might show someone other than Shakespeare to have been the author. Whoever wrote them, the manuscripts of Shakespeare's plays had never been found. Their discovery would be of the highest value to history and to literature, Wilberforce proclaimed. Indeed, he added, to the consternation of the plaintiffs and the Shakespeare scholars, the revelation of a manuscript would contribute, probably decisively, to a solution to the authorship problem, and this alone is benefit enough. So Miss Hopkins' bequest to the Francis Bacon Society was upheld. The 1964 trial did not rule directly on the authorship question, did he or didn't he, but it raised the problem of authority. Were the Shakespeare scholars called to testify to the traditional attribution in support of Miss Hopkins' irritated heirs infallible? Was it possible that heretics, non-specialists, might be right? Behind the observations that a settled scholarly tradition can inhibit free thought and heretics are not necessarily wrong, lay the whole history of knowledge, of truth perverted by confirmation bias and groupthink, of scholars clinging to outdated theories, contemptuous of ideas that threaten their authority, of long-held certainties rendered quaint by new knowledge, of entire fields revolutionized by heresy. The trial had the effect of displacing the authority of the scholars, making them mere witnesses, biased, partial, and putting the truth in the hands of the court, which concluded, in fact, that the truth was not certain. In private, some Shakespeare scholars will actually admit that they have doubts about the authorship. Yes, of course, Shakespeare could have been a pen name or a scam or a committee of Bacon, Marlowe, Oxford, Henry Neville, one professor wrote to me, listing some of the alternate candidates. As we exchanged emails, it seemed that this professor was perfectly fine with letting Shakespeare be seen as the author, even if he knew it might not be true. I think we've got a big enough task in figuring out what the plays are doing in themselves, he explained. Although I wondered if knowing more about their author wouldn't help with that. Shakespeare is a mystery that scholars cannot explain. Shakespeare's knowledge of classics and philosophy has always puzzled his biographers, admitted the scholar E.K. Chambers. A few years at the Stratford Grammar School don't explain it. Others have tried to resolve the puzzle by downplaying Shakespeare's erudition. The plays merely looked learned, especially to the less literate public, insisted Harvard's Alfred Harbridge. But the plays have sent scholars writing whole books on the law in Shakespeare, medicine in Shakespeare, theology in Shakespeare, Shakespeare in astronomy, Shakespeare in music, Shakespeare in Italy, Shakespeare in the French language. The creative artist absorbs information from the surrounding air, Harbridge assured his readers, floating a theory of education by osmosis. Throwing up his hand, Samuel Schoenbaum, one of the 20th century's leading Shakespeare scholars, resolved the conundrum by explaining that Shakespeare was superhuman, an explanation that is, of course, no explanation at all. The mystery inspires our awe. It's part of what we love about Shakespeare. It's part of what makes Shakespeare Shakespeare. He satisfies our need for the sacred, for something that surpasses our ability to understand. In the West generally, and in Britain in particular, he functions as a kind of secular god. And this may be why the authorship question has taken on the fanatical, emotional veneer of a religious war. No one takes kindly to the denial of his God. In 2011, one of Britain's leading Shakespeare authorities, Sir Stanley Wells, said, "It is immoral to question history and to take credit away from William Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon." I love this quote. Immoral to question history, when inquiry is the very basis of the historical discipline. The authorship question is a massive game of Clue, played out over the centuries. The weapon is a pen. The crime is the composition of the greatest works of literature in the English language. The suspects are numerous. The game is played in backrooms and basements, beyond the purview of the authorities. Now and then reports of the game surface in the press, and the authorities, by which I mean the Shakespeare scholars, are incensed. They come in blowing their whistles and stomping their feet, waving their batons wildly. They denounce the game in the strongest terms, attacking not only the legitimacy of the question, but also the sanity of those pursuing it. Their protest is too much. It is so excessive, so disproportionate to its object that it only confirms for the players the worthiness of their pursuit. And when the authorities finally retreat, red-faced and sweaty, exhausted by too much baton waving, the players quietly set the board straight and continue playing, fortified by their oppression like some persecuted religious sect. The game is its own reward, the pursuit of truth and intrinsic virtue. One can get postmodern about the truth. One can argue that the author is merely the creation of various cultural discourses, that texts are continuously remade by the actors that perform them and the readers that consume them. But one cannot get around the fact that some person or persons set those words down on paper. Who done it?
Who done it, indeed. So this leads into what I want to say first, which is that this deeply researched, scholarly, historical, and textual analysis of the authorship question is also a page-turner. It reads like the best kind of mystery novel. Every suspect and body of evidence, as it's presented, as I was reading it, I said, yes. It must be him. Then a new suspect, and I thought, well, obviously it's her. Oh wait, no, it's Oxford. No, it's Marlowe. No, Sydney. At the end of mystery novels, we find out who done it. But that is not the point of Shakespeare Was a Woman and Other Heresies, I think. This is a book about asking questions, about how ideas become entrenched, about scholarly passion, and where it can lead us on both sides of this question. So I'm honored to be here tonight to ask my own questions of the author of this extraordinary book. And I want to start with a kind of prologue, if that's okay. You wrote a piece in The Atlantic in 2019 called Was Shakespeare a Woman? So first, what prompted that article for you? And what was the reaction from English department scholars across the land?
That's a good place to start. I studied Shakespeare in school as a student. I studied the plays, and I was fascinated back then by Shakespeare's women. I wrote about the feminism of the plays and gender in the plays. And I didn't think at all about the authorship question. I'd heard that there sort of was a question, but you don't study it in school, and it wasn't raised by my professors, so I didn't think there was much to it. And I went off and wrote about other things. And then in the sort of Me Too movement era, there was all this interest in sort of recovering women and thinking about women's lost and unrecognized roles in literature and history. And I happened to go to a production of Macbeth, and I was reminded again of Shakespeare's incredible women and just sort of this question of how Shakespeare came to write feminist drama. The scholar Juliet Dusenberry, Cambridge scholar, says Shakespeare's drama deserves the name feminist, for in his plays, the struggle is for women to be human in a world that declares them only female. And so many scholars have acknowledged this. There's another scholar, Anne Barton, who says Shakespeare has this uncanny understanding of women, which is missing in the works of his contemporaries. So how did Shakespeare come to write feminist drama? Where does this uncanny understanding of women come from? And I remembered that there was this question around Shakespeare's authorship. And so I started reading just kind of on a lark at first, thinking I wouldn't find anything. And you immediately get drawn into it because it is such a mystery and it's so compelling. And there's all these gaps and you're like, oh my God, what is going on here? And I wanted to understand why all these great thinkers, Henry James and Mark Twain and Walt Whitman, had doubts about the authorship. You know, where is this coming from, and why is it so forbidden to talk about in English departments? The reactions to the article. Yes. It was interesting. It was polarizing. It went sort of viral quite quickly. People loved it or hated it. I was attacked as a conspiracist, neurotic, fantasist, compared to anti-vaxxers and even Holocaust deniers, because I was denying Shakespeare. So it was this really heightened emotional language, which at first was incredibly upsetting and mortifying to be public. I had never been publicly attacked like that as a writer before, so that was a very new experience for me and really shocking.
I mean, few of us have been attacked like that. I've read some of those attacks.
Yeah, but when the initial shock subsided, I realized, oh, this is quite interesting, that these responses had given me something to think about, and it was almost like they had planted signs that said, dig here, because why were they framing a literary historical question as a moral problem? And that to me was such an interesting thing to dig into. And so that the book then, the initial Atlantic article was just about one candidate, Amelia Bassano, and sort of the argument for her case, but then the book was about the whole taboo, why doubting Shakespeare became the biggest taboo in literature.
And so did you, in some ways, take this as I don't want to say a dare, but as a challenge, all the negative reaction, because many people would have just said, run away, and not...
I probably should have. That probably would have been the wise course to take. I didn't go there for a while. I didn't touch it for about a year, and I wrote about other things, and I kept reading about it because you just get sucked in, and so I was thinking about it, and there was just such interest in it, and people wanted to know more, and there were so many questions about it, so I guess I did take it as a dare. That's an interesting way to put it. I hadn't thought of it that way before.
Well, a challenge.
To me, it's simply interesting that there is this academic taboo on a fascinating topic, and how has this persisted in the modern university system? And I wrote about it just because I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, and it is. So one of the things that I'm going to quote you, scholars maintain that no one doubted Shakespeare until the 19th century, that the authorship question was one of the silly products of the Victorian age, like phrenology or spiritualism. Reading through the literature, I found this statement repeated again and again. Reading through a lot of this stuff, I kept coming across that too, and reviews of your book. But you mentioned a number of allusions during Shakespeare's lifetime or immediately after. So when did doubts about the man from Stratford's authorship first appear?
It depends who you ask.
I'm asking you.
Yeah. Well, so the line today, if you ask English professors, is that there were no doubts until the mid-19th century. And so I think that's a way of kind of saying this is not a legitimate topic, because clearly if there was a concealed author, there would have been some sort of gossip about it in the period. And so by saying doubts only arose in the mid-19th century, it's a way of saying this is silly and there's no legitimacy to the subject. And it was just the product of a mad woman named Delia Bacon.
Right.
And we can talk about her more.
Right.
But then other scholars have, more sort of heretical scholars, but also Shakespeare scholars, have published work showing that there were sort of pieces of gossip and rumors and whispers in the literary culture of the period, poems and plays and pamphlets and this sort of thing that seem to be discussing this author and what's going on with this author and who this person is. And it's tricky because it depends on how you interpret these texts. They're poetic texts, and poetic texts can be interpreted many ways. That's kind of the point of them. There's not a single reading. And so scholars want to read them to say that there is nothing fishy here. But there's some pretty persuasive readings that I cite, I think, that show that there were rumors about a concealed author. One of them is about a writer who's hiding like a cuttlefish in a cloud of ink and shifting his fame onto someone else's name. Yeah. Great little snippets like that. And it's about how you want to read them, I think. And so I sort of leave it to the reader to decide what to make of that, because you can argue those interpretations any number of ways.
Yeah, it's very much, there are puns and there are inscriptions and there are things written in margins, and it's very interesting the different ways that people interpret them. The point that I got from the book was, they're there, let's talk about them, as opposed to, they're there, they don't mean anything, let's not talk about them. And talk to us briefly, if that's even possible, about the different anti-Stratfordian camps, their origins, and their defenders. I particularly loved the portion of the book when you visited Alexander Waugh, who's quite a character. And we can start with the woman you mentioned, who decided, yeah.
Well, the first alternate authorship candidate was Francis Bacon, who I discussed in the 1964 trial. And he became popular because he was revered in the 19th century as a genius and a great Renaissance mind. And he seemed to sort of fit the profile of what people thought the author of the Shakespeare works should be like, highly educated and well-traveled and moving in the Elizabethan court circles, tapped into court politics, also a lawyer, and there was all this scholarship coming out at the time showing the deep legal knowledge in Shakespeare's plays, that this seems to be someone who's extremely well trained in Elizabethan law, and there was nothing in Shakespeare of Stratford's recorded history that supported that. So Francis Bacon became the most popular candidate, and there were attempts to show parallels between his philosophical works and the plays. But there are problems with Bacon, and you can't quite pin, there's no smoking gun to pin everything to him. So then other candidates arose, the Earl of Derby, the Earl of Oxford, Marlowe, the spy poet, reportedly murdered in 1593.
That was one of my favorites.
He's a fun one.
Yeah, that's a good story.
And then, of course, the female candidates as well. Mary Sidney was first proposed in 1931 as a kind of group authorship theory, that she collaborated on the plays as part of a kind of studio of writers.
That was the one that was patronized by the Earl of Oxford, or is that? There was one, you were talking about a bunch of writers who were perhaps working together under the patronage of, was it Oxford or was it someone else? Or
I think maybe
I made that up, sorry. That's who wrote him. Now we know.
I think you're maybe talking about the Earl of Oxford is sort of tied to a group of writers that he supported and financed.
That's what, yes,
that's right.
Okay. And each story has, each possibility has so many facts that seem to support it, and then there are facts that seem to support another theory. But one of the most convincing arguments against the man from Stratford, having written the plays and sonnets attributed to him, is that there really is no evidence of him being educated at all. I know people say he went to the grammar school there and may have gone there until the age of 13, although I don't think they kept records at that time, so I don't think there's any...
There's no record. There's an assumption that he attended the grammar school.
An assumption that he went to grammar school,
but the
no
records
records.
don't exist.
But even assuming he did attend, he was certainly not educated the way, say, Ben Jonson was, who came from an equally humble background, I think. And at the same time, we see what you were talking about, that there's so much knowledge in the plays of foreign languages, of court behavior, of history, of specific geographic descriptions, especially of Italy, references to works in Italian that had not yet been translated into English. Talk about that a little bit, his education or lack of it, or the necessity that the texts suggest of someone having had a really good and probably therefore aristocratic education.
They're brimming with sort of the new learning of Renaissance humanism, astronomy and Greek drama, philosophy, Italian literature, the law, and specific geographical knowledge of Italian cities and French court politics, and it's just this great mystery of where how he acquired all of this knowledge. Where did he learn French and Italian? Well, how does he know these specific locations in Italy if he never seems to have left England?
And some of them are very, very specific.
They are,
and
yeah.
have been debunked by scholars. And then you mentioned, well, if you look at a map from the period, you see that, yes, there was a port there, and yes, there was a well right near the synagogue.
It is a funny thing. They want to kind of make Shakespeare not as smart
Yeah.
so that they can keep the author that
Right.
they have. It's an odd thing to want to do to sort of cut him down to size. So the port thing that you're referring to, there's in Two Gentlemen of Verona, Shakespeare sends a few characters from Verona to Milan by boat. Well, this seems very silly because they're landlocked cities. Why would you go by boat from Verona to Milan? So for a long time, scholars said, well, Shakespeare didn't know Italy at all. What a goof. He's just making errors left and right. And then other scholars went and looked more closely and realized actually in the Renaissance, the cities of northern Italy were linked by a series of canals and waterways. So actually the scholars were wrong and it was Shakespeare who was right. And and how did he know this about northern Italy? Had he traveled those waterways? Where does this come? Anyway, so
Yeah.
it's a weird thing that happens where they try to say, yes, Shakespeare was the greatest writer in English literature. He's one of the father gods of the Western canon. But at the same time, he made all these errors in the plays, and actually he wasn't that smart, and he just sort of absorbed information
He
from
was
the
a
air.
genius, but he didn't actually know anything.
Yes, it's an incredible paradox.
Yeah.
And it's this everyman thing where he's just your average guy who somehow acquired all this knowledge, and he becomes a supernatural, a Christ figure. And it's a beautiful mystery, and you have to just sort of accept the mystery. I recently heard someone say that the proper response to the authorship question is to simply venerate his genius, just sort of bow to it. Is that the proper response? That's an extremely religious response. What is that?
It's a very religious, I mean, and you and other people who have questioned this have been treated as heretics.
Yes. Well, I love being a heretic, so
yes,
that's perfectly fine.
That's what it's all about. So your book and a lot of scholars have raised so many questions and doubts and so many possibilities about other authors who may have used Shakespeare's name. But if you had to argue from a Stratfordian point of view, can you give us any evidence, or at least what Stratfordians consider evidence of Shakespeare of Stratford being the author of the plays and sonnets? I mean, surely there has to be some origin story to this origin story.
Well, his name's on the title pages.
So-
He was a shareholder in the theater company that
Right.
produced the plays. So that's a pretty good connection. He was a businessman, involved in investments in property and the theater. In the works of Shakespeare are praised in his lifetime, but the question is there. But whoever
are they
was
praising?
Shakespeare is being
Yeah.
praised, but who is Shakespeare? That
Right.
name is being praised, but who
Right.
stands behind it? Right. And then in 1623, it's the first folio that's really the major statement that sort of ties the author to, or seems to tie the author to Stratford upon Avon, and calls him Sweet Swan of Avon, and sort of this line about thy Stratford monument, and that comes 7 years after his death. There is no mention when he died that the great poet Shakespeare had.
Yeah, that's very
It's a bizarre absence.
baffling
Yeah.
that there was no mention, no ceremony, no sadness, or
Right.
anything. So knowing that what we're talking about is basically a name on a manuscript with very little to back it up, and a lot to make us question if the person behind that name was the one who really wrote these things. why do you think Shakespeare scholars are so fiercely protective of this person, and even if the evidence is so slim? And if you want to tie that into, you write that. Well, we'll talk about English departments next, because that was, I thought, really interesting. But why do you think this religious fervor has developed? And I think it's developed on both sides. I mean, I was reading stuff from, from the Oxford Bulletin of, and they're pretty hopped up also, and people get very, very attached to their person.
Yes, they do.
And it's a little bit like sports teams where, it doesn't really matter who wins the World Series. It's a game, it's baseball, but people are, will have fistfights and that.
People feel a personal attachment to Shakespeare, or their idea of who the author was, and there's a deep personal attachment that happens, and kind of projection of yourself in some ways onto the author. I mean, I think to understand Shakespeare scholars, you have to understand the whole history of how ideas about Shakespeare developed, and go back to the 18th century when pilgrims started flocking to Stratford-upon-Avon to pay homage to the poet and throwing themselves down at the birthplace, the purported site of his nativity, and sort of weeping and cutting relics from the local mulberry tree like pieces of the true cross, singing odes to Shakespeare. So there's this worship that starts happening, and it's called bardolatry. George Bernard Shaw termed it bardolatry. And why does that happen in the first place? You can theorize about that. I think one person I talked to said it has to do with the sort of the back and forth divisions in Britain between Catholicism and Protestantism, and the deep divisions in the country around faith and religion, and that Shakespeare sort of becomes this unifying national icon that the whole nation can come behind. And then with the growth of empire, Shakespeare becomes a sign of Britain's cultural superiority and its right to rule, because we have Shakespeare. And it's during this period of extreme veneration that English departments develop, and Shakespeare is really institutionalized in the mid-19th century. And these ideas about Shakespeare that were enshrined during this very religious period get passed down from one generation of scholars to the next. So I think that's part of it.
Yeah, and one of the things that you mentioned in the book is that this is a time when religion is becoming less powerful among the people.
Right.
And so this is something that's encouraged by the ruling classes, because we need something to keep the people together and keep them from rioting. That's a very crude way of putting it, but something that I just never thought of this, and I did not know this, but you write that at the beginning of the 19th century, there were no English departments and no such thing as a degree in English literature. I had no idea. I found this astonishing.
It is something we assume that has always just sort of existed as a classic.
There's math,
right,
which you avoid, and then there's English, which you are drawn to.
It wasn't considered something you needed to study, because Englishmen read literature in their free time, or gentlemen read literature in their leisure time.
Yeah.
And if you wanted to study literature, you studied the classics. So there was no formal study of what they were like. What is there to study? You just read it. It's for fun. But then in the mid-19th century, it begins to become an academic discipline. Yeah.
Do you think this question of authorship resonates differently for Shakespearean actors than for academic scholars?
It's a good question. It sort of depends on the actors. I mean, Sir Mark Rylance, the former artistic director of Shakespeare's Globe, is sort of one of the most famous Shakespeare skeptics in the world, and Derek Jacobi, famous Shakespeare actor, is an Oxfordian. Michael York. So a number of actors have tended towards the heretical side of things. But then there are others, Kenneth Branagh, for instance, who's deeply, deeply devoted to Stratford Shakespeare. It's hard to say. I'm thinking now also of the director of the Royal Shakespeare Company, Gregory Doran, who a few years ago he said, "Who wrote Shakespeare? I don't care. Whoever he, she, or they were, we've got the plays, so it doesn't matter. So you get that attitude too from actors that they don't care about the authorship or the history. They are recreating the plays themselves.
text,
it's their interpretation that matters.
Yeah.
It's really an individual thing. Some people are drawn to it. Some people.
Well, one of the things you quoted Rylance saying, which I really liked, he said, I really like that there are different windows into these plays. That's my image of it, really. The Shakespeare works are a house, and you can go and look in one window or another. Each case provides a different perspective and reveals a different quality in the works. He liked exploring the haunted Shakespeare house, visiting the different rooms with their different authors. And then he said, the Stratford biography is a welcoming front door, but you can get no further than a front hall with a lot of locked doors. Bacon's window looks into a study with musicians playing and mysticism. With Oxford, you see Italy and this extraordinary psychological torment and passion. I wander around the question in that way, without feeling that I want it to be one big room, he explained. I don't want to have a modern architect come in and knock all the walls out. I like that each one is different, and I love being welcomed into each room and hearing what people say. Oh, you want me to come into that room? I love this room. Let's hang around in this room for a while. I really liked that.
He has the most beautiful approach.
Yeah, I mean,
to the question.
it's wonderfully open in so many ways, and I was also very taken with your passages about the Shakespeare scholar Roz, is that how you say it? Roz Barber, and who wrote a fictional work called The Marlowe Papers, and she signs her letters "Together in Doubt," and that seems to me like the basis for a truce. Do you think that will ever come?
Will it come? People have been predicting that it will come for a long time, that finally, the truth will be acknowledged. I am not holding my breath, I guess.
Or even if the truth is not acknowledged, at least a truce between the warring camps, do you think, where people can say,
people
let's
love to
examine...
fight way more than they like peace. Mark Twain has a great line. In 1909, he wrote that it would be 3 centuries at least before Shakespeare clears his pedestal. So if Mark Twain was right, and he was quite a wise man about a lot of things, we still have 2 centuries to go. It's a question of how paradigm shifts occur in any discipline, and they're slow, and they happen gradually with the sort of changeover of the guard. There's a Max Planck quote that science advances one funeral at a time.
Yeah.
And it may happen that way. But then when they happen, then it's sort of sudden. Then all of a sudden, everything changes in a discipline. You think of Alfred Wegener's theory of continental drift was ridiculed for decades before it was finally accepted. Or historians saying that Thomas Jefferson definitely didn't father children by his slave Sally Hemings, because how could you say that about the father of American independence?
Yes.
And now there's a whole exhibition at Monticello on the fact that he had children by his slave. So these shifts happen, but it's hard to predict when they'll happen. And I sort of don't care if it does or not. I'm not deeply invested in that. I think that it's the controversy that's fascinating.
Yeah. I could tell. The book is feisty, shall we say. So do you want to take questions?
Oh, sure.
Now? Do you have anything else you want to say that I didn't ask about?
No, I'm happy to talk about any aspect of the book.
Shall I speak up?
You have
no, I'm going to give you a microphone because we're filming this, and so I want it to be captured. So,
So we get on tape. Thank you so much for your presentation and your book. I'm Bill Yeomans. You know my twin brother. But your contribution as a young scholar and writer, you've changed the whole attitude of the field by listening to everybody as a reporter. So how is your career as a reporter made this work so impressive?
How have I approached it as a journalist? As a reporter? Well, I suppose I decided that I wasn't going to be arguing for any candidate in this book, that I didn't want to be a sort of a partisan, although I've taken obviously the more heretical approach of acknowledging that there might be a question. And I just wanted to report on the theories that are out there and talk to all the people involved in the debate, whether that's Shakespeare scholars or the heretics. And so the journalistic approach was to interview all of these people. And I go around in the book talking to Stephen Greenblatt, the great Harvard scholar, and Stanley Wells in Stratford-upon-Avon, and Mark Rylance in London, Roz Barber at her home in Brighton. And it's this sort of fun, weird journey through the Shakespearean underworld. And I liked being able to take the position where I wasn't going to try to argue that it was this person or that person, but just tell the reader about the theories and let you make up your own mind.
But the reporting part of it was actually, I think, added to the suspense because a lot of the scholars, when asked certain questions, would just, they wouldn't answer. It was more, it was no comment, basically. So it was it was very interesting. Let me ask you one question before. Did you think of this? I mean, it really does read like an incredible mystery story. And I read a lot of them at night. It's my guilty pleasure. And this is like a really, really well-structured one. Was that at all in your mind as you were writing it?
A mystery story?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean that's what makes this question so fun. That's what draws people in. But also it gives you a great way to structure what is otherwise really academic, dense, historical material.
Yeah.
But if you immediately can put it in the form of a thriller, not a thriller, but a mystery, then it keeps people reading through all of the dense material to figure out, who done it.
Exactly.
So it's fun in that it just lends itself to that format. Yeah.
Well, I don't know anyone else who's done that, so I like that.
Thank you.
Thanks. Do I have to stand or I'm good? Okay. So it sounds like you took a really awesomely objective approach at all this. So my question is, if there was definitive evidence that ever came up that pointed in one specific direction, what do you think the reaction would be of anyone who is not already sort of in that camp?
It's a good question. I mean, a lot of people think they have found evidence that proves their candidate, right? Whichever candidate that is, and then they're dismayed when other people don't accept their evidence. So much of the question comes down to how you interpret evidence, and that's a lot of what the book ends up being about, that it's so hard to arrive at an objective.
But if there was undeniable, if it just new evidence, undeniable, came up, do you think then it would be accepted, or is it so
Sure,
rooted in the psyche?
if a document was discovered saying, I wrote Hamlet, but then there would be disputes about that's forged, or how can we, it's amazing the way people will not accept what's right before their eyes because it doesn't fit with their preconceived ideas about things. I mean, it's really tricky. That would be nice if that happened.
Hi there. Really obscure question, but back 100 and some odd years ago, a psychiatrist by the name of Jones wrote a monograph about Shakespeare. And he looked at these tragedies that appeared pretty close one after the other, and he decided that whoever wrote these plays wasn't taking any position on the question, but that this suggested a major psychiatric turmoil. And you look at Hamlet, and Hamlet is looking at death right in the eye in a way that most of us would not, and he goes through that. So in the people that you studied as possible candidates, is there any evidence for the equivalent of a nervous breakdown that occurs before these great tragedies actually appear?
Yeah, I mean, that is an interesting question, the psychology of the author and how that is reflected in the plays. I think a lot of people tend to look at the Earl of Oxford and his sort of very eccentric, tempestuous, temperamental behavior as representing something Hamlet-like. That's a popular theory. He was certainly psychologically the most perhaps tormented of the authorship candidates. But everyone has breakdowns at some point in their life, so this is another one of those things that you can sort of fit to whichever candidate you like. You can find psychological moments of despair in almost everyone's life. It's an interesting way to look at the plays.
Okay, first you, and then you.
You mentioned Sir Hugh Trevor Roper, Lord Dacre, the Regis Chair of History at Oxford, right? And that he expressed in the 1964 trial a little bit of an opening to if new evidence comes forward. In your research, did you come across, I have read that in some personal private letters from Hugh Trevor Roper, he acknowledged a much more open doubt that he could not commit himself to in public, and then and later, of course, he signed off on the Hitler diaries, and so he was needing to guard his reputation more clearly. I just wondered if you had run across any of those the correspondence in which he expressed doubt more openly.
Yeah, there are some private letters in which he wrote that the evidence for Shakespeare is weak and unconvincing, and he said something like, if evidence for a different author came forward, I wouldn't be at all surprised. So he's much more explicit about it in those letters than he was in the earlier trial. And he was really troubled by it, actually. It really bothered him, the mystery. He wrote an essay called What's in a Name, playing on the Romeo and Juliet line. So if the author had a different name, would he still smell as sweet to us? And it is interesting that Hugh Trevor Roper, as a historian, was much more skeptical about the whole thing than his English literature colleagues. That disciplinary distinction, I think, is significant.
Thank you for a really wonderful presentation, and I love your openness to the whole idea of just saying, look in this room, look in this room, look in this room. You mentioned Stanley Wells, whose attitude is, one could say, implacable, because, he used to be the chairman of the Birthplace Trust. I too have interviewed him, but I wondered if you, in understanding Stratford's, I'm talking about the whole town now, their reticence to hear someone coming in and saying, oh, it's so-and-so, because this is the goose that lays the golden egg for Stratford, and that's totally understandable. But have you ever found a crack in the armor where you know, they know they're on thin ice?
A crack in the armor. Stratford-upon-Avon is full of cracks. Yeah. It's almost entirely composed of cracks. Yeah. There's a chapter where I go to Stratford and sort
pots.
of... Sorry?
And pots. Cracks and pots.
Explore the whole history of I go there and explore the whole history of the tourist industry and the birthplace and all the sort of, the properties there, the claims that Shakespeare was born here and his son, and it's all, they can't document any of it. And in my interview with Stanley Wells then, it's a really interesting interview, and I'm excited for people to read it because there are so many pieces of evidence that I try to bring to him and ask him just, what he makes of them in his opinion, and he just sort of keeps saying, I don't know about that, I don't remember that, and it was just like he was evading every question I tried to put at him. I felt like I had a witness on the stand who was just claiming amnesia about everything, and it was so hard to question him then. But that evasion was telling in itself because it was sort of an abdication of his authority as a scholar, that he couldn't answer these things about fundamental texts that he's supposed to have studied his whole career and he's written books on, and he's just neglected them or kind of papered over them. And that abdication of his authority sort of, I mean, why shouldn't other people then step in to fill that vacuum if he can't answer these questions, if there's other people who can? So I think that to me was a pretty significant crack in his armor. And then just, there were moments in our conversation where he sort of let things slip. Like at one point, I was asking him about one of the sonnets where the poet says, let me go untold. And I asked, what did he make of that? And he said, well, it sounds like he wants to remain anonymous. And I thought, do you hear what you just said? Are you agreeing with me? This is very confusing. And then at another moment he said, Shakespeare lived a sort of double life. So I suppose if you're a psychiatrist, you might say those are Freudian slips of a sort.
As an English professor who also is a skeptic, one of the few, I am shocked by how many of my colleagues don't even think about the question or never even heard of it, including one of my colleagues who wrote his dissertation on father figures in Shakespeare following a Freudian analysis, did not know that Freud was an Oxfordian. Never even heard that. Kind of shocked me. I'm wondering if that's shocked you too. You're talking about Wells sort of covering up some of his doubts, but I'm wondering if you were surprised how few people even thought about the question or came up with their own theories about the question.
It is kind of shocking, actually, when you start asking people. And it's a weird thing because most Shakespeare scholars just study the plays and poems and they don't write about the biography, which is perfectly fine. That's the kind of scholarship they want to do. But it's bizarre that there's not a greater desire to know where these works came from, and that they're just sort of, there's a kind of complacency, like, well, this is what we know about Shakespeare of Stratford, and it's a mystery, and it's a beautiful mystery. Let's just revel in the mystery of it and his genius. And there's such a lack of curiosity there, which is what I find so baffling. How, as an intellectual, you can't, be a little bit more curious about these works that you've dedicated your whole career to. In my final interview in the book, I meet with the Harvard professor Marjorie Garber, very famous scholar, and she has written some 20 books on Shakespeare. She's a brilliant, brilliant scholar, but she just won't look at the biography or the author. And when I asked her what her position was, she just said, I'm interested in the plays, I'm interested in how they've been performed and how they've been interpreted, I'm interested in the characters, I'm interested in the language. So she was interested in everything to do with them except who wrote them. And that, I just couldn't quite understand that. How can you, but it was like she had put blinders up. She just wasn't going to go there, and that sort of tells you everything you need to know. That it was just, she had decided that was not an area of research for her. It's a very strange phenomenon, but I'm delighted to have an English professor in the audience who's interested.
You're right, though. You don't really want to talk about it too much in the department. One of my friends, Laura's kids, that writes for the New Yorker, I told him to come up there to school. Sorry. That you're being bullied in a school, and he did a cartoon in the New Yorker where two Stratfordians are bullying this other kid, saying, I hear you think Edward de Vere wrote the play.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that was my friend after talking to him about that. He published that.
Oh, it's a great cartoon. Actually,
yeah.
It's in the book.
Oh, really? Oh.
It is, yeah.
A few more. Did you
My oldest friend is a protege of Harold Bloom, and I assume he'd probably already passed away maybe when you were beginning your process with this. But I'm curious, two questions, sorry. Little question is if you got any kind of a whiff of where he had stood on the question. Because when I was talking to my friend in a cafe in Paris and the Shakespeare identity question came up, authorship question, he was practically weeping in his tea, saying, "Oh God, he didn't want to hear it. It was the guy in Stratford, 100%." And I said, "Well, I think there's a lot of people that's not true." And his comment was, no, because if we dethrone this genius, then no one will read Shakespeare anymore. And I don't know if anywhere, no, but I mean, you know, the more that we reveal the man behind the curtain, you know what I mean? It's like, are we then not going to revere these things? And I'm saying this is happening in a lot of different realms, I think, right now. So in your travels and your talks, did you ever get a whiff or have a thought that there was a bigger fear, not just like, oh, you know, my argument I will lose, but that we're losing this thing that we've all been holding up so high if we demystified it?
It really is like religion. It really is what you were saying. It's a religion that...
Well, people become psychologically invested in beliefs that they've held for a very long time, whatever that belief is, political belief, literary belief. And they also respond basically as fans of Shakespeare. So it's like Taylor Swift fans. If you say something about Taylor, God help you, right?
Well, but that's
fair. It's the same thing.
That's fair.
What? It's
That's
the same
fair.
kind of reaction. They're responding as fans to this person that they think they know, and they have an idea of who it is in their head. And if you tell them, Hilary Mantel has a great line, if you try to take away from people the history that they first learned, it feels like you're taking away their childhoods, because people are attached to the first history that they learn. But I really like your question, and I think that it does have to do with the sort of existential position that English departments are in right now. You know, this great fear that the humanities are dying. There was the New Yorker article about the end of the English major. And I do think it gets to this fear that if we don't have Shakespeare anymore, that's all that English has. So, I mean, not actually, but that we have Shakespeare, so we'll survive because we have Shakespeare. And if you mess with that belief, even though obviously whoever wrote these works, you know, what's the name doesn't matter, but it is this sense that if you try to pull down this statue, it's just, it's too threatening somehow.
But doesn't that remind you a lot of Bible studies and when people don't want to learn about real historical...
Absolutely. Well,
I mean, it's fascinating how the parallels
in the 19th century, I mean, part of the reason the authorship question sort of exploded in that period was because it was the same period in which people were doing biblical research questioning the authorship of the Old Testament and the New Testament and saying, actually, these works were written hundreds of years after, you know, the New Testament, at least after Jesus died, and they're not eyewitness accounts, and actually anyway, it was throwing all sorts of doubt on, the authenticity of biblical history. And then people started thinking the same thing about Homer. Well, who was Homer really? And then also who was Shakespeare really? So it's all connected, that strain of criticism. Where were we?
Bloom.
Harold Bloom. Harold Bloom never wrote a Shakespeare biography, which is interesting. But he wrote that huge tome, the Western Canon, and Shakespeare is one of the gods of the Western Canon in that tome, and the invention of the human, that Shakespeare invented our modern idea, Bloom says, of what it means to be human. So he never, to my knowledge, publicly questioned the authorship. But there's so many of these scholars, when you get them behind closed doors, will tell you something a little bit different. So it would have been so fun to interview him, but I missed that.
Thank you. So my background is actually in history. I find your inquiry like so refreshing because I teach writing, and so I live in a world of complet people, but my background is in history, so it's infuriating to me that these questions aren't being asked all of the time. And so I'm really curious what responses you've gotten from departments outside of English, outside of complet, and what those have been like.
Yeah, it's so interesting. As soon as you go outside the English department, people are so interested in the topic. And I talked to a historian, a Harvard-educated historian at the University of Illinois, who told me she thought it was unethical for scholars to be presented with evidence and, some persuasive alternate authors and theories and not take it seriously. She thought it was a sort of dereliction of their scholarly duty. Then there are psychologists who are really interested in understanding the sort of the both the psychological development of the author and the nature of genius, because to just say that, well, he was a genius, that doesn't explain how the works were written. Genius has to be, it's talent nurtured by education. So there are professors who study genius who have said this doesn't make any sense at all. And we should understand the life of the person who created these works if you really want to understand the nature of genius. Then there are professors of history one professor of history I know taught an authorship course at the University of York in Canada, and his colleagues in English scoffed, saying that no one would sign up for that absurd course. And then there was a waiting list every year, and the students loved it. But then that professor retired, and then the course wasn't taught. So it's dependent on these sort of individual renegades coming along and arguing for it. I mean, there's an anthropology professor at Rutgers who said that to ask Shakespeare scholars to examine the authorship is like asking the College of Cardinals to investigate the resurrection. So he brings an anthropological lens to it. This is about sort of culture and people and group dynamics. So it's so fascinating to talk to different people from different fields because they will all look at it through their own disciplinary lens and bring new insights to the problem. You talk to Italian scholars and they will go on and on about Shakespeare's knowledge of Italy and how did he know this specific thing in Padua and Florence and Italian artwork. So it's actually a really interdisciplinary subject, which in some ways is why I think English professors haven't really been able to tackle it, because you have to know so much information from so many different disciplines to sort of begin to grapple with it, which should make it a perfect subject for the modern university, which loves interdisciplinary pursuits, right? But somehow it just ends up falling between all the cracks.
Next, well, hi. Okay, I'll play the contrarian. And because I'm surprised that the one department you didn't mention, for instance, right now is the drama departments. And I think for most drama department people, the fact that you could have an actor from Stratford do this makes complete sense. So, two-part question. Do you, it seems, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like the greatest argument against Will from Stratford is, again, he couldn't be educated enough. He it's the academic argument against it. Is that accurate? Is that the greatest piece of evidence you have? And then secondly, out of curiosity, you mentioned Professor Bloom. What do you think about contested will and James Shapiro's work?
Ooh, I told you this was a really good crowd.
The doubts about Shakespeare spring from so many different areas. One is the education. Of course, it's totally possible that someone could come from a very modest background and learn all of these things. That, of course, that's possible. Christopher Marlowe was the son of a cobbler, and he received a scholarship to one school and then a scholarship to Cambridge, and wrote plays that were considered, rivaled Shakespeare's. So the problem with Shakespeare is that there's just no evidence of how he acquired any of the knowledge in the plays. It's just a total blank. So he left no traces whatsoever and that's hard to understand in a society that was really a record-keeping society and kept very well, there is a lot of documentation from Elizabethan England. So how he managed to acquire all this knowledge and leave no trace whatsoever of how he did so, that's the big mystery there. But then you can argue, then there's the will and the fact that in his will he doesn't mention anything about a literary life. He doesn't mention poems or plays or books, or there's no trace of a life as a writer in that will, where he meticulously bequeaths so many of his possessions, his silver gilt bowl and his sword and his second best bed, but nothing about poetry. So it's the accumulation of all these different things that creates doubt. And I think the actor point is a good one. Clearly, the author was someone who knew the theater world, absolutely. But there were other people who were also involved in theater in that period. And so when skeptics point to other authors, one thing they look for to fit the profile of the right profile is someone who had some kind of involvement with the theater. So Mary Sidney was interested in drama, and the Earl of Oxford was a patron of various theater companies. So you can find other people who are also tied to the theater world. Contested Will, and James Shapiro. You'll have to read the book. I think Contested Will is, it's a book that was written to defend the traditional attribution. So he has a very specific agenda in mind, and a kind of, I don't know if you want to call it a bias, but he's not open to the authorship question. He calls it a conspiracy theory, and he doesn't in the book acknowledge any of the evidence for alternate candidates, and he seems to think that anyone who questions this subject has something sort of mentally deranged about them. So I think it's kind of lacking as a work of scholarship. I think there are a lot of problems with it. Frankly, there are errors in the book too, which he gets away with because he's a tenured professor. So I wanted to speak with him. He was one of the people I wanted to interview, and he refused to talk to me in the book. But I've put the rejection in as sort of part of the story. You know, some people just don't want to talk about this subject. But what I was able to do was go to the Folger Shakespeare Library and read his correspondence with Justice John Paul Stevens, which is really, really interesting. This exchange between an arch Shakespeare defender and a sharp legal mind on the authorship question. Of course, Stevens was an Oxfordian tended towards the Oxfordian theory, this exchange on evidence it's really interesting. And Shapiro ends up sort of throwing in the towel and cutting off the correspondence at the end of it because he just he can't take it. And I'm very interested to see what people make of that exchange because I don't think he comes out very well in it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank
so
you.
wonderful. And thank you, Elizabeth. Such a great program. I can't wait to see what this guy's colleagues at UCLA say in all departments. Both Elizabeth and Kathy will sign their books, and so and I look forward to seeing you at upcoming Writer's Block events programs. Thank you so much.
Thank you.